You might wonder how I got selected to do this. I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a psychiatrist. I was an Army officer for a long time. I probably came to doing this ultimately because I did have what would be considered a definite adverse experience earlier in my career. During the first Gulf War in 1991, I was shot down and captured by the Iraqis. So I was shot, I was in a helicopter, I was on a search and rescue mission. I got shot while the helicopter was still flying, and then we crashed, and then I had a concussion, and most people on my crew were killed by the crash, and there were 3 survivors, of which I was one. I'd been shot, I broke both my arms, I had a transected anterior cruciate ligament, I was pretty badly injured, and captured then. Interrogated, kept for a week, ultimately sort of dragged from one bunker to the next. You know, had a gun held to my head as sort of a mock execution. So most people would say that was an adverse experience in anyone's description. Personally, my training just kicked in, and I just approached that as I approach any problem, whether it's, I don't know, running out of firewood in the winter when I lived in a little log cabin. I mean, it was just another problem, and I approached it the same way. Fix what you can, and then work hard to make it as good as you can what you can't fix. So, for example, yes, there's no question my arms hurt. I mean, can't argue with that. But I did realize pretty quickly that that if I didn't move anything, and I wasn't being driven someplace, they hurt way less. And so you just made that into a new normal and appreciated that, because there's nothing you can do about it. I mean, they're broke. You can't change that. So it's how you think about those things. But if you sat there and focused on the pain, it would have hurt more. And that's what you need really to learn. And so I just learned those things, and make things as good as you can was just one of the things I learned early on. When I got back from, they finally had the big prisoner exchange. They exchanged the Iraqi prisoners for the Americans and the other allies, and I got back to the States, and I just thought I would just go back to work. I didn't really think it was a big deal. I started getting asked by all sorts of people, really, how did you make it? And I really thought that was an odd question. I said, well, what else was I going to do? Of course I made it. And I realized that not very quickly, but with some reflection, that was a very serious question, because they would then follow that question with, I don't think I would have made it. Now, I thought that was I thought that was very sad, actually, that there are people who live their lives in fear, who think if something bad happens, I won't make it. I would not want to face the rest of my life thinking that way. And so, I went through the rest of my Army career, and eventually we had the war on terrorism, and now there's a whole pile of people going to war again. And there was a lot of adversity in going to war again, for rotation after rotation, and there were a lot of people who weren't dealing with that all that well. And so the Chief of Staff of the Army said, Rhonda, we need to do something different. We need to, instead of just finding more and more people with problems and trying to treat them, we need to do that, of course, but we need to help do something preventively. We need to do some kind of mental health promotion to prevent people from doing badly. And I said, amen, sir, we certainly do. We look at physical fitness. I mean, we assess people, we do PT training every day. We need to do the same sort of thing with mental fitness. And luckily, there are well-researched strategies that will make people more mentally and emotionally strong. Now, those were primarily done, and they were certainly started and promulgated mostly by Dr. Seligman and the University of Pennsylvania, but they've been replicated a lot of places. People have done very similar things. It's basically teaching people these thinking skills and about decision-making, communicating, and thinking. The recognition that it's not what happens to you, it's how you think about what happens to you that leads to the consequences, that leads to either your emotions or behavior. And so I was very fortunate to have the opportunity to sort of begin that program for the United States Army.
Were you a naturally resilient person beforehand, though?
There's no question. I was a very resilient person to start with. And I can kind of pinpoint many of the things that made me that way. It was having parents that taught me early on that, Rhonda, you can do anything you want, but you can't do everything. So it taught me A, confidence, but prioritization. I had a grandfather who was a Marine in World War II who taught me that, that pride and honor are very important. He used to say that there's worse things than dying. There's living with dishonor. And so, I remembered that. So I'm thinking as we're crashing, well, at least I'm dying doing something honorable, which was a pretty comforting thing because, pride and not disappointing people was important. I had learned when I was a medical student, I had a professor of surgery who, when I was giving a presentation, I said something about doing a biopsy, but I would be afraid that, and he said, Dr. Cornum, stop. You are in general surgery now. You may be wrong, but you are never afraid. And, I've never used the word fear to describe anything since then because it never helps, ever. Now, I've talked about, contingency planning, and I've talked about anxiety, but fear, that gut feeling that prevents you from seeing choices, that's not a helpful thing to feel. So don't. So yes, I had been allowed to fail. I mean, I showed my dogs from the time I was 13. I didn't, the judge didn't care that I was a kid. It was my first dog. I was only going to win if I had the best dog and showed it the best. And so I lost a lot the first couple years, but I got a lot better. And so yeah, I was a resilient person to start with. But now that we know that there are ways to teach people to become more physically, emotionally, and mentally fit, we should take advantage of them. And we should, and even though I was, in fact, a very resilient person, I didn't have a vocabulary. I just did those things, in my mind, it was kind of natural to do them. But I couldn't teach it until I learned the vocabulary to describe it. I just, I could lead by example, but if you don't know how to tell people what steps you take to get there, they can't do them. But that was the beauty of when we started the Penn Resilience Program, which is essentially the same skills that we're teaching now, is that there are certain very discrete, very concrete steps you can take to get your mind thinking the right way. Now, I won't tell you that everybody is going to be, I can't take Bambi and make Rambo necessarily. But I can't take anybody and make them able to run a 5-minute mile either. But I can take everybody and make them faster. Just like I can take everybody and make them a little bit, at least, more psychologically fit.